The legal shockwave began when multiple states moved to challenge actions taken under the administration of Donald Trump involving the distribution of billions in federal infrastructure dollars, originally authorized under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That law, signed in November 2021, approved roughly $1.2 trillion in total spending, including about $550 billion in new federal investments targeting highways, bridges, public transit, rail corridors, ports, airports, broadband expansion, water systems, and electric grid upgrades. These funds were designed to flow to states over a multi-year period through formula allocations and competitive grants administered primarily by the U.S. Department of Transportation, along with other federal agencies. The conflict erupted when state officials argued that executive branch actions were effectively slowing, conditioning, or reinterpreting how portions of that congressionally appropriated funding would be distributed. For governors and attorneys general, this was not a policy disagreement. It was framed as a constitutional dispute over who controls federal spending once Congress has appropriated it. At the center of the legal fight is a fundamental constitutional principle rooted in Article I. Congress holds the power of the purse. Once lawmakers authorize and appropriate funds, the executive branch is tasked with executing the law, not rewriting it. States challenging the administration's approach argue that any broad withholding or suspension of appropriated infrastructure funds could implicate the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, a statute passed after President Richard Nixon attempted to refuse to spend environmental funds Congress had approved. The Supreme Court's 1975 decision in Train v. City of New York reinforced limits on executive authority to decline spending that Congress had directed. That precedent looms large in the current dispute because it established that the president cannot frustrate legislative intent simply by declining to release funds. State filings reportedly rely heavily on that historical framework, arguing that infrastructure allocations tied to formula, grants, and statutory criteria must move forward absent a lawful rescission request submitted to Congress. The financial stakes are enormous. The infrastructure law allocates tens of billions of dollars annually for highway formula funding alone, with additional billions flowing into transit modernization, bridge rehabilitation, and broadband deployment in underserved communities. State transportation departments structure multi-year capital improvement plans around predictable federal reimbursement schedules. When funding certainty is questioned, even temporarily, the ripple effects can be immediate. Construction bidding seasons are carefully timed, bond issuances are calibrated to anticipated federal matches, and contracts with private builders are negotiated months in advance. A delay of even a quarter can disrupt procurement cycles, increase borrowing costs, and push projects into the next fiscal year. States argue that once contracts are signed and matching funds committed, uncertainty over federal disbursement exposes them to legal and financial risk. The administration's position, according to public statements surrounding infrastructure oversight debates, emphasizes lawful review authority and compliance verification. Federal agencies routinely assess whether projects meet statutory eligibility standards and may pause disbursements pending review. The legal question is whether such review crosses into unlawful withholding if it significantly delays or alters congressionally mandated spending flows. That distinction, administrative oversight versus de facto impoundment, is what makes the dispute explosive. If courts interpret executive actions as exceeding statutory authority, they could issue injunctions compelling immediate release of funds. If courts side with the administration, it could expand presidential flexibility in managing appropriated programs during policy reassessment. For everyday Americans, the conflict is not abstract. Infrastructure dollars finance bridge repairs in rural counties, transit upgrades in major cities, water treatment modernization in aging municipalities, and broadband access in communities that still lack reliable connectivity. Contractors hire workers based on anticipated federal reimbursements. Engineering firms scale operations around project pipelines built on federal, state cooperation. When funding certainty falters, payrolls, supply chains, and local economies feel the pressure. Governors warn that prolonged litigation could stall critical projects tied to public safety and economic growth. What makes this moment volatile is not simply the size of the money involved. It is the constitutional boundary being tested. The courts are now positioned to determine whether executive branch discretion in administering infrastructure law remains firmly subordinate to congressional appropriation directives. The outcome will not only decide how quickly roads and bridges get repaired, it will define how far presidential authority extends when billions of taxpayer dollars are on the line. The confrontation over infrastructure money did not erupt overnight. It built gradually as policy signals emerging in late 2024 transitioned into administrative action in early 2025 under Donald Trump. During the presidential transition period following the November 2024 election, advisors publicly indicated that certain implementation priorities embedded in the rollout of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act would be reassessed. That law had already been in effect for over 3 years, with formula funding streams flowing to states annually and competitive grants awarded through programs administered by the U.S. Department of Transportation and other federal agencies. By early January 2025, states had structured transportation improvement plans, issued bond projections, and scheduled contractor bids based on expected federal disbursement calendars that had been operating under established guidance since 2022. Tensions escalated when federal agencies began reviewing certain discretionary grant programs and compliance criteria tied to climate resilience standards, environmental review benchmarks, and project scoring frameworks that had been incorporated into prior rounds of competitive funding. While agencies possess oversight authority to ensure statutory compliance, state officials argue that the scope and timing of these reviews created practical delays in already anticipated disbursements. The distinction between oversight and withholding became central. States contend that once Congress appropriated funds and statutory eligibility requirements were met, federal agencies are obligated to release allocations within established timelines unless Congress formally authorizes a rescission or deferral under the Impoundment Control Act of 1974. That statute requires the executive branch to notify Congress if it seeks to withhold or cancel appropriated funds, preserving legislative supremacy over spending. Legal filings from state coalitions reportedly cite the historical precedent of Train v. City of New York, 1975, in which the Supreme Court limited President Nixon's attempt to decline distribution of environmental funds Congress had directed be spent. That case clarified that the executive cannot frustrate congressional intent by simply choosing not to release funds already authorized and appropriated. States argue that infrastructure allocations, especially formula highway funds distributed under predictable annual schedules, fall squarely within that principle. The administration's counterargument emphasizes the necessity of administrative discretion to ensure projects meet statutory standards and fiscal responsibility benchmarks before taxpayer dollars are disbursed. The legal conflict therefore centers on interpretation, whether administrative review in early 2025 constituted routine oversight or an effective suspension of spending authority beyond statutory limits. Behind the constitutional language lies a more granular financial reality. Infrastructure programs often rely on complex funding structures involving federal matching formulas, state contributions, municipal bonds, and private sector contracts. When federal funds are delayed or conditioned beyond anticipated timelines, cascading effects occur. States must adjust procurement schedules, contractors must recalibrate labor deployment, and bond markets reassess risk exposure tied to expected federal reimbursements. Even temporary pauses in discretionary grant awards can disrupt planning cycles that operate on multi-year horizons. State transportation departments argue that uncertainty in Q1, typically the preparation phase for peak spring and summer construction, forces conservative budgeting and may defer projects into subsequent fiscal years, increasing total project costs due to inflation and supply chain volatility. The political context intensified the dispute. Infrastructure funding is not merely administrative, it is visible. Bridge replacements, rail expansions, and broadband installations are tangible symbols of governance. Governors in both large and mid-sized states publicly emphasized that infrastructure law implementation had bipartisan origins in Congress in 2021, and they framed current litigation as defense of legislative authority rather than partisan opposition. The administration maintains that executive agencies must have the flexibility to reassess guidance to align spending with updated policy priorities and compliance interpretations. That divergence between state claims of unlawful withholding and federal claims of lawful review has now crystallized into active litigation. What makes this phase particularly combustible is timing. By early 2025, the infrastructure law had moved beyond initial rollout and into full-scale execution, meaning billions were already flowing annually under established distribution formulas. Alterations or reinterpretations at this stage affect projects that are mid-design, mid-procurement, or mid-construction. The clash is therefore not over hypothetical future allocations, but over funds integrated into active state budgets. Courts will now examine whether executive recalibration crossed into statutory overreach. The outcome could redefine the boundaries between congressional appropriation authority and executive implementation discretion, a constitutional fault line that has not faced this level of scrutiny in nearly half a century. The economic consequences of the infrastructure funding dispute are not theoretical projections, they are already appearing in state planning documents, contractor communications, and municipal finance discussions in early 2025. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was structured as a multi-year capital investment program, with roughly $550 billion in new spending layered on top of baseline transportation authorizations, and its design assumed predictable annual outlays. When states raised legal objections to actions taken under the administration of Donald Trump, they did so in part because even short-term uncertainty can destabilize long-range infrastructure financing models. Highway formula funds, for example, are distributed to states according to statutory formulas, and departments of transportation build 5-year capital improvement plans based on those allocations. If disbursement timing becomes unclear during the first quarter of the fiscal cycle, when bid packages are finalized and contracts awarded, agencies often delay procurement to avoid exposure to reimbursement risk. That delay ripples immediately into the construction sector. The construction industry depends on sequencing. Contractors secure labor, lease heavy equipment, and order steel, concrete, and specialized components months in advance. According to industry data associated with infrastructure rollout projections, hundreds of thousands of jobs nationwide are supported annually by projects tied to the 2021 law, including engineers, electricians, heavy equipment operators, and materials suppliers. When state transportation departments signal uncertainty about federal reimbursements, contractors slow hiring and defer capital expenditures. In early 2025, several states publicly acknowledged reviewing project timelines to ensure they would not overcommit before litigation clarified federal obligations. That precautionary posture alone can translate into postponed job offers and scaled-back subcontracting. Municipal finance markets are also sensitive to federal infrastructure flows. Many large projects combine federal grants with state funds and municipal bond issuances. Bond rating agencies evaluate the reliability of anticipated federal matches when assessing project viability. If federal disbursement becomes contested in court, cities may hesitate to issue bonds or may face higher borrowing costs to compensate for perceived uncertainty. Even marginal increases in interest rates can raise total project costs by millions over the lifespan of a major bridge or transit expansion. Analysts monitoring early 2025 developments noted that while no widespread bond downgrades had occurred, finance officers were closely watching the litigation because prolonged disputes could influence future issuances. The human dimension is equally concrete. A bridge rehabilitation project delayed by one construction season extends detours for commuters and prolongs safety concerns in structurally deficient corridors. Water infrastructure upgrades postponed mid-procurement can defer improvements to aging pipelines vulnerable to leakage or contamination. Broadband expansion in rural communities, funded in part through infrastructure law allocations, affects access to telemedicine, remote education, and small business connectivity. When states argue in court that funds must be released promptly, they often cite these tangible community impacts. The legal filings may focus on constitutional clauses and statutory language, but attached affidavits frequently reference specific projects awaiting federal confirmation. Small and mid-sized contractors face particular vulnerability. Unlike multinational engineering firms, many regional builders operate on narrow margins and depend on predictable cash flow from federally backed projects. A temporary halt in project awards can create liquidity stress, especially if firms have already invested in equipment or workforce expansion in anticipation of contracts. Suppliers of raw materials, from aggregate producers to steel fabricators, adjust production schedules based on anticipated infrastructure demand. When procurement slows, upstream suppliers feel the contraction as well. This cascading effect underscores why states describe the funding dispute as economically destabilizing rather than administratively routine. Public confidence also enters the equation. Infrastructure law implementation since 2022 has been one of the most visible federal investment efforts in decades, with signage on job sites and public announcements emphasizing modernization. When legal conflict surfaces over distribution authority, it injects uncertainty into a program widely framed as bipartisan and long-term. Communities expecting groundbreakings or project expansions may see timelines shift without clarity on final outcomes. Governors have argued that unpredictability erodes trust in federal, state cooperation frameworks essential for capital planning. None of this presumes final judicial outcomes. Courts will determine whether executive actions constituted permissible administrative review or crossed into impermissible withholding under statutory and constitutional standards. But the economic ripple has already begun, not because funding has permanently vanished, but because uncertainty itself carries measurable cost. Infrastructure is not an abstract budget line, it is labor schedules, procurement contracts, bond covenants, and daily commutes. When those systems pause, even briefly, the impact spreads through payrolls, municipal balance sheets, and community expectations. The accountability spotlight in this dispute falls squarely on both federal and state leadership, as the litigation over infrastructure funding exposes the delicate and often contentious balance between executive discretion and congressional authority. At the federal level, Donald Trump has been sharply criticized by governors and attorneys general from multiple states for taking what they describe as unilateral steps that interfere with congressionally appropriated funding flows. Public statements from early 2025 indicate that Trump's administration sought to reassess compliance and eligibility standards for a range of discretionary grant programs tied to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, citing policy realignment priorities and administrative review. However, the states argue that this approach crossed a constitutional line, effectively delaying billions in funding to projects already designed and approved under statutory guidelines. The central question of accountability is whether these actions represent lawful oversight or a de facto impoundment of congressionally mandated spending, and courts are now being asked to determine the extent of presidential authority in executing federal law once funds have been appropriated. State leadership also occupies a prominent role in the controversy. Governors and attorneys general from more than a dozen states, both Republican and Democrat, have filed lawsuits claiming that the executive actions create financial and operational harm for their constituents. Early 2025 filings highlight that states rely on predictable federal allocations to fund multi-year transportation projects, including highway repairs, public transit expansions, broadband deployment, and bridge rehabilitation. Governors from states with both large urban populations and rural infrastructure needs have publicly framed the dispute as a defense of congressional authority and a protective measure for taxpayers, contractors, and local economies. These state leaders are now legally and politically positioned as the counterweight to federal executive discretion, highlighting the ongoing tension in American federalism between centralized authority and state autonomy in managing federally supported programs. The controversy deepens when examining ignored warnings and prior communications between federal and state agencies. According to court filings, states claim that repeated notices, budget submissions, and compliance reports were submitted in good faith, but received delayed or ambiguous responses from federal officials. Internal memos obtained during pretrial discovery reportedly indicate that some federal agencies were aware that delayed release of funds could disrupt project schedules, influence labor deployment, and increase borrowing costs for state-backed bonds. These documents suggest a conscious awareness of the downstream impact, raising questions about whether executive oversight crossed into discretionary interference that could be challenged legally. Contrasts between public messaging and administrative actions have further fueled outrage. While statements from federal officials emphasize policy alignment, fiscal prudence, and statutory compliance, states argue that the real-world effect was the suspension or slowing of planned disbursements, creating uncertainty for ongoing construction, maintenance, and modernization projects. Media reporting in early 2025 highlights this tension, noting that while press briefings framed executive action as routine review, project managers, municipal finance officers, and construction firms experienced delays with immediate operational consequences. The juxtaposition of policy framing versus practical impact has intensified scrutiny of accountability, putting federal leaders on the defensive and elevating the stakes for judicial interpretation. The legal implications of the dispute are magnified by the scale of the funds involved. Highway formula funding alone accounts for tens of billions annually, while competitive grants for bridges, ports, airports, and broadband add billions more. Any court ruling that determines the executive overstepped its authority could compel immediate disbursement, with ramifications for construction projects, labor schedules, and municipal financial planning. Conversely, a ruling supporting administrative discretion could expand the executive's ability to adjust or condition distribution of congressionally appropriated funds, setting a precedent that could influence future appropriations in areas ranging from public health to defense. At its core, the accountability question is as much political as it is legal. Leadership choices by the federal administration have triggered cascading economic and operational consequences, while state leaders have mobilized litigation to assert constitutional checks. The unfolding scenario highlights the high-stakes interplay between policy intentions, legal authority, and the tangible impact on communities, contractors, and taxpayers. Every delay, every paused grant, and every letter of objection contributes to the narrative of responsibility or perceived failure, and underscores the crucial role of leadership in navigating the intersection of law, finance, and public trust. The dispute remains unresolved, with courts poised to determine where accountability ultimately lies, and the outcomes will reverberate well beyond the immediate fiscal year. The long-term consequences of the ongoing infrastructure funding dispute are poised to extend far beyond temporary construction delays, potentially reshaping economic, social, and political landscapes across the United States. If federal disbursements remain entangled in litigation, or if executive discretion is broadly upheld, states face the risk of cascading project deferrals that could stretch into multiple fiscal years. Infrastructure projects, particularly those reliant on federal formula funding or multi-year grants, are inherently long-term commitments. Bridge replacements, highway expansions, port modernization, and broadband initiatives often take 3 to 5 years from design through completion. Any disruption in the expected flow of federal money threatens to stall planning, contract execution, and labor allocation, with costs escalating due to inflation, supply chain volatility, and increased borrowing expenses. Municipalities that have already issued bonds based on anticipated federal matches may find themselves overextended, creating fiscal stress that could ripple into higher local taxes or deferred public services. Education and healthcare systems are indirectly affected as well. Although not the primary recipients of federal infrastructure grants, both sectors rely on reliable transportation and broadband networks for daily operations. School buses and emergency access routes depend on well-maintained roads and bridges. Delayed infrastructure maintenance can compromise student safety and commuting reliability. Broadband expansion, a central element of the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, impacts remote learning, telemedicine, and digital inclusion in rural and underserved communities. Delays in funding distribution therefore extend beyond economics into social equity, affecting children's education outcomes and public health services. Early 2025 reports from state education boards indicate that districts in rural counties are already adjusting technology plans due to uncertainty in broadband deployment schedules, highlighting the real human cost of stalled infrastructure money. Economic decline is another looming concern. Contractors, laborers, and suppliers depend on predictable federal disbursements to maintain operations. Even short-term uncertainty in Q1 2025 has prompted several regional construction firms to postpone hiring, delay equipment purchases, and reevaluate subcontracting agreements. The ripple effect extends upstream to raw material suppliers and equipment manufacturers, magnifying financial stress in industries heavily dependent on infrastructure projects. According to early economic modeling cited by state filings, a multi-quarter delay in federal infrastructure payments could slow GDP growth in construction and related sectors by as much as 0.2 to 0.3 percentage points annually, particularly in states with major highway and transit modernization programs underway. Unemployment spikes, reduced business investment, and diminished consumer confidence could follow if the litigation extends through the majority of the fiscal year. Service shutdowns and widening inequality are further projected outcomes. Communities that have relied on timely federal investment for aging water treatment facilities, bridge replacements, or transit expansions face the risk of longer-term service interruptions. The resulting deterioration disproportionately affects lower-income neighborhoods, rural areas, and communities already struggling with outdated infrastructure. Public safety concerns, delayed emergency response times, and restricted access to essential services exacerbate inequality, creating the appearance that federal inaction or executive overreach translates into tangible hardship for the most vulnerable populations. Governors and state agencies argue that each month of uncertainty compounds these inequities, demonstrating that infrastructure law implementation is not merely an administrative or legal concern, but a matter of social justice. The unresolved nature of this conflict also frames a broader constitutional question. How far can executive discretion extend in administering congressionally appropriated funds before it undermines legislative intent? Early 2025 litigation underscores the stakes. A court ruling in favor of executive flexibility could expand presidential authority in ways that influence not only infrastructure spending but other critical domains such as public health, disaster relief, and defense appropriations. Conversely, a ruling upholding strict congressional oversight reinforces the balance of power between legislative and executive branches, ensuring that billions in taxpayer money follow the path determined by elected lawmakers. Ultimately, the fallout is a test of governance, accountability, and public trust. Communities, contractors, and state agencies are left in limbo, with every delayed bridge, road, or broadband line representing real economic, educational, and social consequences. The question for citizens and policymakers alike is not whether the crisis will worsen, the risk is already materializing, but how long these delays and uncertainties will be tolerated. The courts now hold the power to define the boundaries of executive authority, but the human and economic costs are accumulating daily, offering a stark warning. When billions in federal infrastructure funds are caught between litigation and administration, the consequences extend far beyond the courtroom into the very fabric of American life.